And it's now been 1 month since longtime Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was ousted from power after that lightning rebel offensive from Islamist-led coalition Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. International leaders are still determining how to deal with the new rulers in Damascus. Speaking this Wednesday, French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot said some sanctions against Syria could be lifted, quote, quickly. EU sanctions in Syria are currently blocking the delivery of humanitarian aid and hindering the country's recovery. Well, that comes as international flights resumed out of Damascus Tuesday, a move that many hope could help put the country's economy back on its feet. We're going to talk more about this now with Aaron Zellin, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Aaron, thanks for taking the time to speak to us. It's been 1 month since the fall of the Assad regime. Is it too soon to take stock of how HTS is doing there?
I think that overall, we can say that they've been able to consolidate, at least in the areas that they control. Of course, the northeast of the country remains out of its hands due to continued fighting between the Turkish proxy Syrian National Army and the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. But overall, they've been able to get the legitimacy that they needed to start, governing essentially in the areas that they control. At the same time, much of the leadership of the new administration are mostly HTS loyalists. So a lot of it's more of the same of what we saw in northwest Syria before the fall of the regime.
Indeed. So you said the fighting is still going on in parts of Syria through these proxy groups. I mean, tell us a bit more about that and how bad that is.
Well, we see deadly attacks every single day between the Turkish proxies and the U.S.-backed forces that are supposed to be fighting the Islamic State, which is one of the worries that these Turkish-backed forces could overthrow the forces that are fighting ISIS, and therefore that could lead to the return of the Islamic State. Thankfully, so far, we haven't seen the Islamic State take advantage of the fall of the regime. No attacks during Christmas, no attacks during New Year's, which would have been prime targets historically. So that's a good thing, but there still are definitely many dire potentialities.
You're currently working on your second book, which is on the history of Syrian jihadism. I mean, how do you see this rise to power of HTS fitting into this path that Syria has been on, particularly when it comes to the Islamic State group?
I see it as part of this broader process that we've seen going back to the early 1960s when the Baathists and then later the Assads came into power, where you saw a secular state essentially being implemented, and then one that was personified by a core group of Alawites, and therefore you had a core group of Sunni Islamists trying to overthrow what they perceived as irreligious state. And they've finally been able to do this. However, there is a big difference between HTS and ISIS. I think we can already tell in the months since they've taken over the country that they operate much differently than ISIS did when they were controlling parts of Syria and Iraq.
Indeed. And that's, of course, reflected in the diplomacy we've seen over the past month. I mean, what do you think about the way the international community has reacted to this?
I think the international community has understandably wanted to make sure that there is a stable country going forward. It is in the middle of the Arab world, and therefore what happens in Syria does not necessarily stay in Syria, as we've seen over the last decade plus, and it affects the stability of Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, as well as anything related to global security potentially due to the Islamic State. And so I think most countries, especially in the West, as well as Arab countries, are trying to make sure that happens. And that's why we're already seeing a bunch of humanitarian aid going in. But now with the easing of potential sanctions at the United States just in the last couple of days, it's possible that this could lead to more economic activity as well.
Indeed, which is something just to remind everyone that Syria needs direly. I mean, it's a country that's been in an economic freefall. I mean, are you hopeful for the future of Syria at this point?
I'm hopeful, but at the same time, I'm also a bit guarded. I mean, many people have been talking about the shape of this government and the potential for inclusivity. Thus far, it's mainly been HTS loyalists. And so there are a lot of questions that continue to be raised about this. They're supposed to have a national dialogue originally in the beginning of January, then it was pushed to mid-January. Now there's no specific date. Part of it is a logistical problem since they didn't realize, ruling a whole country is maybe as difficult as it is compared to just a small area of northwest Syria. So there's a lot of questions that remain. Again, it's only been a month. But so far, in terms of a stability standpoint, overall, I think most people are happier that there hasn't been sort of this large scale revenge killings against, say, the Alawites, or an Alawite insurgency against the new government. And so overall, it's a positive, but there's still a lot of things that should be better that I think many Syrians hope for.
And just to wrap up, how are the former backers of the Assad regime being treated now by the HTS? And is there any likelihood that they might coordinate to try and fight back?
Well, there are people that were previously part of the regime, that were part of the bureaucracy of the government, that continue to work to this day. Unlike when the U.S. invaded Iraq, there hasn't been a de-Baathification. They've kept the institutions so that the state would continue. HTS is mainly only going after remnants of the regime who have been involved in violence after the fall of it. Everybody else that was part of it, they've kind of let live and continue their life, and have been part of sort of this so-called settlement process where they are getting in touch with the new administration, so they're aware of who these people are, but they're allowed to live their lives again.
All right, Aaron, thank you for that. Aaron Zeline speaking to me there from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thanks.